Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for this month's installment of the High Availability and Disaster Recovery Virtual Chapter. I am your host here today. My name is John Starrett. I'm an independent consultant, and we also have David Klee with us co-hosting the meeting.
Hi everybody.
So here are some of the logistics for today's meeting. If you want to put any tweets out there, please do. The hashtag we'll be using is HADRVC, so please make sure you use that as your tweeting way during today's meeting. Unfortunately, we won't have a conference bridge, so the only way you're going to get audio today for our presentation is through GoToWebinar, the functionality that's built in. Audio will also be disabled for attendees, just to kind of help with noise control. But if you have any questions, please share them. We want to make this as interactive as we possibly can for you. So throw those questions in the Q&A section of the GoToWebinar, and we'll make sure we get those routed here today at the end of the presentation so Dave can get through as many of these as possible. Also, if you need to step away for any reason, or you have some friends that would really benefit from seeing this, we are recording the meeting and we will make it available on our website for you. Finally, at the end of the presentation, there will be a short survey. It's about 3 questions, shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Please go ahead and fill that out so we can make this virtual chapter better for you. So if you're new to the High Availability Virtual Chapter, welcome. We're glad to have you. To make things simple, we meet on the second Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So today we actually have Dave Bermingham on the line who's going to go over Windows clustering new features for Windows 10. And then in February, we're actually going to have Paul Randall talk about corruption, some survival techniques for corruption. And then in March, we're also going to have Kendra Little talk about how you should configure quorum for SQL Server. And then we'll also have Ryan Adams here speaking in April. So a lot of great stuff's lined up for you here in the near future. If you're new to PASS and virtual chapters, there's a plethora of them. If there's something you want to learn, the odds are there is a virtual chapter for it. The following are some other virtual chapter meetings that are coming up here this week. For example, we have Business Analytics, we have PowerShell, Fundamentals, a lot of great stuff going on this week. That's all free training for you. So no money's required at all. The pizza is virtualized. Other than that, it's the same things you'd expect out of a user group meeting. Now for paid training, there's the Business Analytic Conference coming up in April, and I would strongly recommend that for anyone here that's into analytics. Here is a list of some up-and-coming SQL Saturdays, and I highlight Austin because I am the organizer, so if there's anyone that's going to be there January 31st in a couple of weeks, please say hi to me. I love to be able to meet the people who are part of the virtual chapter. Also, if you have any interest in being a volunteer with PASS, whether it's locally or on a bigger scale, go to volunteer.SQLPass where you can find opportunities for you to help out. Also, if there's anyone in the community you would like to volunteer, you could do so in 2 different ways. So there's the Outstanding PASS Volunteer, which is given out to 1 single person per year. It's actually stoked that I was nominated for that last year and considered. And then there's also a monthly award that you can nominate for. Finally, if you want to stay in touch with PASS, you can do so in many different ways on social media. You can connect in via LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or also directly through the PASS website. All right, and finally this time here we'll transition over to the presentation. Dave Birmingham's recognized within the community as a high availability expert and has been a clustering MVP since 2010. And with that, David, we'll go ahead and switch it over to you and let you begin.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Just give me a moment here, and I'll figure out how to share my desktop, and we'll get started. There we go. All right. Hey, John, does that look good? Am I sharing the right desktop here?
Yep, looks perfect. Your PowerPoint deck's up.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that introduction. Again, my name's Dave Bermingham. I am a Microsoft Cluster MVP for the past 5 years, which basically means I do a lot of work in the community around clustering. So I've been at plenty of those SQL Saturdays that John mentioned, as well as I have a blog called Clustering for Mere Mortals, which has a lot of really good information all on high availability failover clustering. And fortunately, my job at SIOS Technology as a senior technical evangelist really allows me to focus in that space as we focus on high availability solutions for Windows and Linux. So anything about failover clustering, that's really what I'm all about, and that's really my area of focus. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking about SQL Server 10 or the technical preview. It's something that Microsoft released this past fall, which is a very early look at what's coming down the road with the next version of Windows Server. And I was really hoping when I put this on the calendar that there might have been an update that I could talk about at this time, but as of now, we're still looking at that technical preview. So everything I'm talking about today is currently available to download and to test and kick the tires in the technical preview from the Microsoft site. And primarily in that technical preview, there are 3 new features that I want to touch on and talk about in this webinar today, and we'll take a look at the actual product and some demonstrations as well. And those features listed here, you see Cloud Witness, Storage Replica, and SQL rolling upgrades. So jumping right in, Cloud Witness, which is really one of my favorite new features here in SQL Server 2012. In SQL Server 10, is the ability to use the cloud, in this case Microsoft Azure Cloud, as a witness when you're configuring your cluster quorum. And I saw that Kendra Little is going to be talking all about configuring quorums in Server at an upcoming virtual chapter meeting here, so that should be interesting. So Cloud Witness is something new that is in Windows Server 10 that is going to allow you to leverage the Azure cloud, in particular storage part of the Azure cloud, as a witness in your cluster. And why is that interesting? And we're going to go into the next few slides to talk about why that's important. Primarily, the main reason it's important is that it solves what I call the third data center problem in multi-site clusters. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive into quorums, and I do recommend that you attend the session that Kendra is going to put on about quorums. She'll tell you everything you need to know. I also wrote a blog article that was picked up by Microsoft Press. The link is here, but if you Google Bermingham quorums, Microsoft Press, you should come up with this link as well, and we'll try to post it in the chat window later. This will give you a really good history on quorums through the ages, as well as quorum options today, and how to configure quorums and what you need to know about quorums. So we're not going to do a deep dive about that, but read that for additional information on quorums. And the Cloud Witness, this link here, the final bullet, this is the official documentation on Cloud Witness and what it does. So you're definitely going to want to check that out as you go to configure the Cloud Witness. And there's a few blogs out there, including on Clustering for Mere Mortals, about Cloud Witness configuration as well. So we talked about the Cloud Witness solving the third data center problem. If you've ever configured clusters, and whether it's an always-on availability group or always-on failover cluster instance, and you've thought about doing a multi-site cluster, you've probably run into this situation where you're trying to figure out how to do that and how to implement the quorum. If you've done your research, Microsoft will tell you that in order to support automatic failover in a cluster without risking false failovers, you're going to have a third location to place your witness. And in this case, the file share witness is what traditionally we've been talking about when we talk about a witness. And a file share witness is simply another Windows server on your network in your domain that acts as a file share that can be a witness in your cluster. It's not part of the cluster. It's just a simple file share that acts as a vote in your cluster. And the reason they say it has to be in a third location, if you think about it logically, here's a picture of a cluster where you have one node in Philadelphia and one node in New York. And in order to support automatic failover in the event of a disaster, Microsoft will recommend you have an even number of nodes in each site. So in this case, we have one node in each site. This could be 2 nodes in Philadelphia, 2 nodes in New York. But regardless, you have to have an equal number of nodes in order to support that automatic failover. And so if we decide that we want to put the file share witness in Philadelphia, as shown here, what happens if that file share witness fails? Well, if it's just a file share witness, nothing is going to happen because SQL 1 and SQL 2 will continue to have votes in the cluster. And with a node and file share majority quorum, as long as you have a majority of votes in the cluster, things will continue to work well. So failure of the file share witness in of itself is not a disaster. But if you have a complete site loss and Philadelphia just goes offline and you expect automatic failover to happen, if you've lost your primary node and your file share witness at the same time, no, I say at the same time because if you read about quorums, there's dynamic quorums, dynamic witnesses. So sometimes you can survive this if things start failing incrementally. But let's just say it's a smoking crater situation where you've just lost that entire data center and you expect failover to happen. It's not going to happen because the backup server, SQL 2 in this case, is only 1 vote out of 3. And so it will not come online, and you would have to force the quorum online in order for that server to recover. And that's true whether this is a always-on failover cluster instance, stretch cluster, or an always-on availability group. So you think, okay, well, what if I put my file share witness in New York, as shown here? That's great, and if Philadelphia fails, New York will come online. Excuse me, will come online. I gotta get a drink here, 1 second. New York will come online because it has 2 votes. However, what happens if I have a simple failure of the WAN? Well, even though Philadelphia is up online, everything should be running fine. If you lose the WAN connection, Philadelphia becomes segmented from the rest of the cluster, and it thinks it only has 1 vote. So it will actually bring itself offline, and New York will form the quorum because it has 2 votes, and it will come online. And so you have a failover just because your WAN failed, and that's not what you want to happen. So what Microsoft would say, find a third location. Now, not everyone has another branch office or data center that they can use for this third location. But in order for this, before Windows Server 10, in order for this to really happen, you would have to have that third location and put a file share witness in that third location. Now your WAN connection between Philadelphia and New York needs to be, solid, but you also have to have some sort of WAN connection between Philadelphia and Chicago to New York. And to be really safe, that WAN connection should have total isolation from the WAN connection between Philadelphia and New York. So if all the fiber between on all 3 of these WAN connections, if all the fiber goes through the same pipe in the street, and the guy is digging the street, and you lose the fiber that carries all your WAN connections, you're going to have you're still going to have downtime in this scenario because each site would only have one vote and it would come offline. So it's not really a great solution overall unless you can really isolate those WAN connections from each other so there's no single point of failure. But that's the way it is. Today, that's the way it is. If you want to have automatic failover in a multi-site cluster, this is really the only way to do it safely. So with Windows Server 10, they introduce the ability to have a file share witness. Not a file share witness, but call a cloud witness in Windows Azure. And if you're familiar with Windows Azure, they have some services there. And one of the services is storage. So it's very simple. I'm going to show you how to configure it, where you can configure a storage account in Windows Azure, and through Failover Cluster Manager, through the quorum configuration GUI wizard, you can choose your Azure storage account as a witness. And so that makes it easy because anyone can configure a storage account in Windows Azure, and you reach Azure through the public network. So you don't have to set up any special networking between, Philadelphia and Chicago. It just goes across your public network. So it's a cloud service. So it's very easy. There's no additional infrastructure cost associated with that. So now this is going to be best practices to configure the Windows Cloud Witness for your clusters instead of a file share witness. And that solves the problem of the third data center, but really this can be used in any cluster, even a single site cluster. You can start using a cloud witness, and that takes care of some other scenarios. One scenario that's very interesting to me is I have customers who are looking, branch offices or retail stores that just want to put up 2 Windows servers, run Hyper-V, but they want to have failover between those 2 Windows servers, and they want to do replication, so they're not going to have a SAN for any disk storage. So now those people, before Windows Server 10, there was really no option other than putting a 3rd server. Now they can do that. They can do that 2-node failover cluster with Cloud Witness as the witness in that cluster. So I'm very excited about this feature. It's really going to be very important moving forward. So I'm going to show you a little bit about Cloud Witness and how it's configured. It's pretty simple to configure. So let me jump out to my my demo site here. Log in. Okay, so if you've never looked at Windows Azure before, this is the portal to manage Windows Azure, and this is where you can configure virtual machines in the cloud. So you can have websites, virtual machines. There's a whole bunch of really cool things you could do in Windows Azure. But one of the basic things you do is configure your storage accounts. And I have a storage account that I'm going to use in this particular demonstration called Cluster 11, but I want to show you what you need to do to create a new storage account. And the good news is you might be thinking, oh, well, so this is going to be, an ongoing expense. I need, some additional monthly charge. Well, in the testing that that's been done so far, Windows Azure rounds to the nearest penny, and we haven't been able to get it to round up to a penny for this charge over the period of a month. So what I'm showing you here is not going to cost you, as of today, not going to cost you anything at all to run. So once you create your Windows Azure account, you're going to go out to the storage configuration, and you're going to click New. And you're going to create a new storage, click Create. Now here's one important thing. Of course, you got to give it a name, and this name has got to be unique within the Windows.net namespace, the core.windows.net namespace. So you'll find something eventually that is not being used. And then you pick a location. Well, there's lots of different locations. You probably want to have it located close to where your cluster's located. So I'll pick US East. But here's the most important thing, and this is in the documentation that you want to do. Because quorums really are the authoritative vote, you really need to make sure that you have control, that there's only one and it has the most current data. So they recommend that you do not do replication of that quorum vote. So we're going to choose local redundant in terms of that storage account. It's not going to be replicated across geographic regions. This is going to be locally redundant. So you want to make sure you choose that option. And then click Create Your Storage Account, and it's going to go off and start creating this storage account for us. Now, I'm going to, kind of like a cooking show, I'm going to take this one out of the oven that we've created earlier. And if I choose Cluster 11, I choose this Manage Access Keys. You can see I have some information here. I have the storage account name, the primary access key, and secondary access key. We're going to use this information when we go to configure the Cloud Witness. So let me jump over into Failover Cluster Manager, and I have a cluster configured, and I have no witness configured yet. I'm going to fess up something here. I was trying to refresh this lab for this demonstration, and things didn't go so well. It won't let me destroy the cluster, so I'm kind of in a weird state. But it's okay. I'm going to still be able to show you what I wanted to show you. But at the end, we'll see that it's actually going to not work as expected. But that's kind of my fault because I have a cluster that's kind of half created and half not. So once I've configured my cluster, as you see here, I have a cluster, and I have 2 nodes in the cluster, primary and secondary, but there's no witness configured, and there's no shared disk that I'm using in this quorum configuration. So to add a cloud witness, it's very easy to do that. We'll go to More Actions, Configure Cluster Quorum Settings, and we're going to select the quorum witness. And here are the options. So disk witness has been around for a long time, and file share witness has also been around for quite some time. But the new feature here is this cloud witness. So if I choose cloud witness, and I click Next, it's as easy as this. It's asking for your Azure storage account name and the Azure storage account key. And so I go ahead and I can copy that information from Azure. This little button here actually copies the information, so you can just copy and paste storage account name and then the Azure storage account key. I'll copy the key and paste it here. All right, so that's really all you need to do. And if I hadn't messed things up, I would click Next, 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 and it would configure. But I'm having some issues here, which I haven't really been able to define. I think it's because actually, if you look at my cluster core resources, there's nothing defined. And so, like I said, I'm kind of in a half-built cluster, but that's really as simple as it is. And there's a couple, like I said, there's a couple articles out there, a couple blogs that walk through this process, but it really is that simple. And once you've done that, now Azure Cloud Services is your cloud witness. So that's Cloud Witness, and I think you're gonna you could do that today, and that works today in the technical preview. So the next feature that you're going to hear a lot about is something called Storage Replica. And I copied this feature list out of this article here. It really kind of goes into some great technical deep dive about Storage Replica. And then in this second link here is a great resource for actually configuring Storage Replica. So you're going to want to check out these links to get some more detail. But essentially, Storage Replica is host-based block level volume replication that Windows Server 10 is going to provide out of the box. And it can run in synchronous or asynchronous mode. With the asynchronous mode, you see here it says server to server only. So what you'll find is that Storage Replica, there's really two use cases for it. One is it's actually going to integrate with Windows Server failover clustering to allow you to build a multi-site failover cluster instance. But with failover clustering, you can only do that with synchronous replication. So you're going to have to choose the synchronous option. But if you want to replicate your data across a greater distance, they will support asynchronous replication. But that is server to server only, meaning it's not going to allow you to replicate a cluster workload across, to a greater, across a WAN with a high latency link. So when we talk about replication in a cluster, it's going to be synchronous replication. The good thing about host-based replication is that it's hardware agnostic. So if you've been around for a while and have built clusters, you know that traditional shared storage clusters require SAN. So you might have purchased some EMC SAN or some NetApp or whatever your vendor of choice is, and you have this hardware, and it's running great for you in your local data center. And all of a sudden you get the mandate that you need to have a disaster recovery plan in place. And so you start looking into how do I replicate my SAN off-site. And generally you can buy another SAN from the same vendor and purchase some array-based replication solution and replicate from SAN to SAN. And even some of those solutions have cluster integration like EMC, SRDF, will enable you to replicate your SAN and integrate with failover clustering to build these multi-site clusters. And that's how you had to do it in the past with array-based replication. Of course, now you're buying two SANs of the same type, so sometimes that can be cost prohibitive, or maybe you've acquired a company and you have two different vendors. So the great thing about host-based replication is that it's hardware agnostic, meaning that you can take your EMC SAN in your primary data center and you can configure in your DR site and just some iSCSI solution or just a SAN from a different vendor. Maybe you don't want to spend as much in your DR site as you did in your primary site, so you kind of skimp on your storage a little bit. With the array-based replication, now you have a problem because the replication is probably not going to work across different hardware types. With this solution, you'll actually be able to have replication regardless of the hardware that you choose in your primary site and your DR site. So that's going to be a big plus for this host-based replication solution. Yeah, it replicates at the volume, so you're not going to pick files and folders to replicate, but you're going to replicate entire volumes of your Windows Server. Again, it will allow you, there's really two use cases right now with the technical preview, allow you to build stretch clusters. So they will show you in the documentation that you can build a Hyper-V stretch cluster and also a scale-out file server stretch cluster. So they're really the two use cases with this technical preview. Now, in the future, will we see support for other cluster workloads? I hope so. I mean, it's really, they're not saying, and of course, it's still early in Windows Server 10 release, so really we have to keep our eyes open for that to see what's going to be supported and what's not going to be supported. And it uses SMB3 as its protocol for replication, so it's very fast, efficient. And if you have RDMA-enabled NICs, you can take advantage of that for faster replication. your Kerberos for authentication and encryption, and it will support dedupe and BitLock, and the management right now is through PowerShell or through the Failover Cluster Manager. So let's take a look at some of the scenarios. So Storage Replica today, if you have, let's say, a 2-node Hyper-V cluster in Philadelphia connected to a SAN, this will allow you to stretch that cluster to an offsite location and actually have it behave like one single cluster here. Now, Philadelphia to New York might be a stretch in terms of latency on the link. You're really going to want to have a high speed, and Microsoft's recommending, I think last I saw was an 8 gigabit link, but they want a very high speed link between the sites with a very low latency. So we're talking about some kind of fiber connection between the locations, because synchronous replication, which is required for a multi-site cluster, the way synchronous replication works is when a write comes down on the source system, that write has to be committed on the target before it's committed on the source. So the write's sent to the target sends an acknowledgement back to the source, and then the source commits to disk. So as you might imagine, there's going to be some overhead associated with synchronous replication. And in the technical preview, they will tell you, do not use this in production, and this has not been optimized yet for performance. So don't even bother doing any sort of performance testing, because the performance as of now is really bad. They know that. They haven't spent any time yet on tuning that. But so assuming that you have that high-speed connection, low latency connection between the two sites, now the two sites really act as one big cluster, and you can move virtual machines between between Philadelphia and New York, and New York and Philadelphia, all with just like it was moving between the same data center. So what are the benefits of this versus like Hyper-V Replica, which does replication now off-site for you? The big thing is it's synchronous. So Hyper-V Replica is asynchronous, and failover, is planned. So it's not as good of a solution if your recovery point objective is zero data loss. You need to guarantee your data is always 100% in sync. You need to have synchronous replication. So what does this mean for the SQL Server admin? We're seeing Hyper-V here, and that's the primary use case that Microsoft is describing today, these Hyper-V clusters cross-site. Well, of course, many SQL Server workloads are running inside of Hyper-V virtual machines, so just keep that in mind if you're looking for a very good disaster recovery solution for your SQL Server workload, and that workload is running in Hyper-V. You can always build a Hyper-V multi-site cluster, and you're going to have a recovery time objective of just however long it takes to restart a virtual machine in the event of a disaster, and a recovery point objective of zero data loss. So that's about as good as you're going to get in terms of disaster recovery for your virtual machines. The other thing is we don't know, and you can hypothesize all you want. Will this be supported with SQL Server clusters? So instead of a Hyper-V cluster, these could be running SQL Server workloads, and there's no reason, there's nothing blocking that today from working. We just need to find out what the SQL Server team thinks about that, and what that means, in terms of supportability, and what versions of SQL would be supported. So keep your eyes open for some announcements there. The benefit of this is, well, you also might be saying, well, Dave, I can do that, something similar today with always-on availability groups, and that's great for off-site replication, disaster recovery, and that's what all that does. And in many cases, that is true. That's going to solve your problem, and you're going to have great high availability and disaster recovery. But I've talked to many customers today where always-on availability groups doesn't solve the problem for one reason or another. And there's really two main reasons. Besides the price of Enterprise Edition, we won't get into that. But assuming that you have Enterprise Edition of SQL Server and you have access to always-on availability groups, if you have hundreds or thousands of databases, always-on availability groups, because it's managed at the a database level, it becomes unmanageable at some point. It's just unmanageable. And if those databases are dynamic, then you have the overhead of managing, adding databases, dropping databases, and it really becomes an issue. And as you add more availability groups, more databases, it actually consumes more resources on the server. So there's an upper limit to the number of databases you can actually add into availability groups. So I have customers who come to me with that problem. And the second problem is not every application works well with availability groups. And primarily we're talking about applications that rely on distributed transactions. So BizTalk Server comes to mind immediately. There's many people who are looking to implement applications, but they need to make use of distributed transactions. Always-on availability groups does not behave well in that environment, so they need to stick with a failover cluster instance, and so they're looking for the kind of availability that they get with always-on availability groups, but in a failover cluster instance. So I talked to those customers today through our company with Sios. We have a block level replication solution that does that, and on Windows Server 2008 R2 and 2012 and so forth. And so they're happy with that solution. Now with Microsoft, are they going to implement that as well with SQL Server? That's that still remains to be seen. But if they do that, then that's going to be a great disaster recovery solution for your SQL Server clusters using shared storage. As I mentioned, also it takes putting all of your, doing a failover cluster instance also eases your management because you don't have to, as you add and drop databases. Block level replication, they don't care whether you're running one database or 1,000 databases. It's still going to be the same amount of overhead because block level replication doesn't really know anything about the files on your disk. So it's going to be able to ease your management and also consume less resources, we're assuming. So Hyper-V multi-site clusters going to be great, but SQL Server, we'll see. There's no word yet, but that's we're kind of holding our breath to see when that would take place. Support for that. And so finally, the third thing I want to touch on that's new in Windows Server 10 is rolling upgrades. And there's a link here that talks about it that you're going to want to check out. And there's articles that talk about this around a Hyper-V workload and a scale-out file server workload. And as far as SQL Server workloads go, again, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. We're just kind of waiting for the dust to settle, waiting for SQL Server to make some official announcements about what's going to be supported, what versions are going to be supported, and so forth. And it tends, traditionally, I see features being introduced in Windows and clustering and then picked up by SQL Server a little bit later, or maybe the next major release. Now with the Windows, if you've been following Microsoft, they're saying they're really going to have a quicker release cycle in terms of Windows. This is what makes rolling upgrades even more important. Before, when you might get a new version of Windows every 2 years, an incremental version every 2 years, a major version every 4 years, you can kind of plan your upgrades around when you're going to replace hardware. Say, well, I'm going to be due for a hardware upgrade in 3 years anyway. So, doing you have my Windows Server 2008 R2 cluster, and that's running fine. Well, here comes Windows Server 2012. Hey, I want to use that. Well, there were quite a few years between 2008 and 2012 R2, so you're probably due from new hardware. So doing the upgrade, you were going to buy new hardware anyway, so you build your new cluster in 2012 and test that out, and then migrate your databases slowly over to the new cluster once you were comfortable on that platform. Now, Microsoft, again, they haven't officially said how fast they're going to be releasing Windows, but faster is generally the word on the street, is you're going to get new versions of Windows at a more rapid pace. So you're probably not going to want to not need to replace hardware as much. You're probably going to want to upgrade operating systems on existing hardware to take advantage of these new features coming out. So to do that, today, if I'm running a Windows Server 20, let's say for example I'm running Windows Server 2012 cluster, and I want to take advantage of a new feature, Windows Server 2012 R2. And so, for instance, like Dynamic Witness, this is a new cluster feature that's only available in R2. To get to Windows Server 2012 R2 today, I'd have to basically buy some new hardware, build a cluster, migrate my databases, and that's not a great use case. I can't upgrade in place. I can't upgrade the operating system in place, and so what Windows Server 10 is going to allow me to do is it's only going to support going from Windows Server 2012 to Windows Server 10. I'm actually going to be able to take my Windows Server 2012 R2 SQL Server cluster, well, presumably SQL Server, but today we're really the use case we're talking about is Hyper-V, can scale file servers, and we're going to say we're going to allow you to actually update or upgrade the operating system on that cluster. We're going to give you a path to do that, and the path is shown here. So again, assuming we're starting with a SQL Server 2012 R2 cluster, and we want to go to one Windows releases, the Windows vNext, whatever they're going to call it, Windows Server 10 technical preview. Here are the steps. So I got my 2-node cluster. So of course, first I'm going to back up the cluster database, and that's important because if you get to the very end and you've updated the cluster functional level and you decide that you want to go back, you better have a good backup. So start with backing up your cluster database. Always a good idea to back up your workload in that cluster. You're going to have to stop cluster-aware updating. You don't want cluster-aware updating to start draining roles on a node in the middle of this process. So stop cluster-aware updating during this whole process. Once you've done that, you're going to, on one of the nodes, presumably the backup node, you're going to pause it and you're going to drain all the roles. So there's nothing running on that server in terms of cluster workload. Once that's done, you're going to evict that node from the cluster. So it's very, right-click on it, evict from cluster, very simple through Failover Cluster Manager. Once that node is evicted from the cluster, you're going to take that server and you're going to wipe it. You're going to wipe the hard drive and you're going to install a clean OS. So you're not going to do, you're not going to upgrade the operating system from 2012 R2 to straight to Windows Server 10. You're going to actually wipe it and do a clean install of that server. Once it's installed, you're going to add a failover cluster feature. You're going to configure the network and the storage so that it can take part of the cluster. And then you're going to add that new node into your existing cluster. So that means you still have one node remaining in your cluster or multiple nodes. You can this will support multiple nodes, but you're going to add this new node into the cluster. So now it's a mixed cluster. You're going to have some nodes that are Windows Server 2012 R2 and some that are Windows Server 10. Once you've added the node, you're going to reinstall your cluster role. So you're going to enable Hyper-V, again, presumably SQL Server in this cluster, so it's also able to support that workload. And now at that point, the workload, you can move it between Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows Server 10. And at the end, so you can run in that mixed mode for extended period of time, till you're comfortable that you're happy with the way it's running. Once you're sure that you like that and you've upgraded all the cluster nodes are upgraded to Windows Server 10, you're going to run this final update cluster functional level, which is a new feature, a new parameter in clustering. And what that is, while you're running up these steps that are highlighted, all during those steps you're running in the cluster functional level 8. And that's just Microsoft terminology, what it is. Meaning you're running at the Windows Server 2012 R2 level. Once you run the cluster add node and you added that you've added a node that's running Windows Server 10, you're still running at the cluster functional level of 8. So still at the Windows Server 2012 R2 level. And you at this point, up to this point, you can still undo what you've done. You can evict those nodes and go back to a Windows Server 2012 R2 cluster. It's not permanent. It's not permanent until you finally run this final update, which updates the cluster functional level to 9. At that point, you can't go back. If you want to go back, that's where you're looking at restoring the cluster database. So you want to make sure that you're happy with all the updates before you run this cluster functional level update. So that's rolling upgrades. And just a moment here. So I'm going to be talking about. I have a monthly clustering 101 session. So everyone online today, if you're attending and you want to register for my clustering 101 session coming up here on January 28th, just for the people online here, it's a special code. Don't share this with anyone else. You're going to lower your chances of winning. If you register today for that session, you're going to be entered into it for a chance to win $25, and they'll draw that next week. But you also will be giving away another $25 Amex gift card the week of the session as well. So go ahead. I think John added that link into the chat window. So
yep, I just did that, Dave, to make it easy peasy for everyone. That link should be in your chat window, so you could just click on that to open it up.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So if you go ahead and register for that. That would be great. We're going to be talking about SQL Server, high availability in VMware. So go ahead and check that out. So at that point, if you have any questions, I've really kind of finished my presentation here, and I'm going to open it up to questions. So I think there's a question tab, or is that how we're going to do it, John?
Yeah. There's a couple of questions here that we've got. First of all, with SIOS Lifekeeper and DataKeeper, Rick is asking if there is a cost-free or reduced option for using this for pre-production environments.
Well, so we're talking about Lifekeeper data. So obviously I work for SIOS, and we are in, we have solutions today that do host-based block-level replication and provide high availability for SQL Server, among other workloads. And the question about pre-production licensing, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have customers who want to get licenses that are for pre-production, and our salespeople are generally able to give discounting on non-production licenses for labs. So yeah, absolutely. There's not a standard part number for that, so definitely if you're interested, talk to your, you can contact me or SIOS in general, and they'll be able to help you out there.
Okay, we've got one more. Earlier, you had mentioned something about it not costing anything to run on Azure. Is that from building it and not actually having it active because no running transactions or anything like that? Or can you elaborate a little more on that comment?
Yeah, right. So as a cluster MVP, I'm privy to a lot of information, a lot of really good feedback from Microsoft, the clustering team in general. And I have to be careful about what I say. There's a lot of NDA information of what I can share and what I can't share. But I think this is information that is not publicly published. I don't think they would mind me telling you. What they told me is they have run this, testing Cloud Witness, and they've been running it for months at a time on active clusters. And again, we're not tracking transactions. We're not tracking SQL Server transactions, right? It's really just an incremented number that's stored in this file. And what they've done is they've run it for an extended period of time, and what they found is that the amount of transactions do not even trigger a payment. So again, because Azure rounds to the nearest cent, they haven't been able to get it to round to a cent, and that's what they've told me. So I believe what they say. I mean, I've had it running for some time, and I don't recall seeing any elaborate charge for storage for that particular thing, but I have a lot of other things going on as well. So that's what I've been told through some testing directly from Microsoft themselves. So this is not a guarantee. Don't come to me if you get a bill for 5 cents, but I don't think you're going to see any huge charge for putting your file share witness in Azure. And actually, I mean, the recommendation that I've been hearing is that they're really recommending Cloud Share Witness as being the way to configure clusters, being the way to configure your witness, even in lieu of disk witness and file share witness. Now, I'm still weighing that in my mind of the benefits of that, but that's kind of what I've been hearing. So we'll see how that pans out. But you won't see, you shouldn't see any big charges for that. And if you have MSDN, you can get I think $100 Azure credit. So you can try that today, and it without any risk at all. But you shouldn't see any big charges there.
Excellent. We have one more in the window here. It's can SQL Server be upgraded as well as the traditional environment during the rolling upgrade of the cluster?
Yeah, good question. No, I mean that's not what this feature will allow. So I'm not a SQL Server MVP, so I don't have any good inside information on that. But even if I did, I couldn't share it. This is strictly for the operating system, so it will allow mixed mode operating systems to run in the same cluster. SQL Server is still going to have to be the same version to take part of that.
Okay. If anybody else has any additional questions at all, please go ahead and put them in the question window. Otherwise, David, if you want to pop up your contact info on the screen, we'll let people make a note of that. And just so everybody knows, this is being recorded. We will have the recording online here probably by the end of the week. And that way, for any of the links or any of the other details, if you're interested, it'll be there for future reference.
Yep, and if Dave allows us to get a copy of the PowerPoint slide, we'll put that up there too, so you guys can click all the links instead of having to type them out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make the slide available, and so you'll have all this information there as well. And I didn't have a contact slide, so I'm typing it real quick here. I'm active on Twitter at Dave Berm. That's probably a real easy way to get my attention. Or Bermingham. Yeah, you can email me at us.sios.com. Yeah, so these are kind of the best ways to get me, and I'd be glad to if you have any other questions, we get on a webinar or a phone call, and I'd be glad to speak with you.
Excellent. Well, hey, thanks for taking the time to speak with the group today. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, for sure.
Excellent. Cool.
Alrighty, everyone. We will catch up with you next month.
Great.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for attending. We'll see you all in a month.